Small businesses across the country are finding themselves in extremely difficult circumstances. Right now, this is a time of crisis. But one of our next guests says a crisis like this can present opportunities for innovation and positive change if you use the time to think outside the box. Stop asking yourself why and start asking yourself why not. Joining me now with some key ideas to help get through this, two very well-known people. Gary Vaynerchuk, he is a modern communications strategist and the CEO of VaynerMedia. Also joining us, entrepreneur Bethenny Frankel. She is also the driving force behind disaster relief initiative BSTRONG, a partner of the Global Empowerment Mission. Welcome to you both. So many questions have come in. Gary, let's go to you first. Businesses who need to pivot, how can they even think about that?
First, reconciling that they have no choice. You know, entrepreneurship and business is all glamorous when the economy is great and everybody's rolling, but this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. And so first accepting and not dwelling, and then really looking at options of what they can do with their resources, whether that's people, physical locations, product and inventory, and then really using the internet as a foundation and infrastructure to adjust to this new reality.
Bethenny, for those who are in the direct-to-consumer business, they're paralyzed right now. There are no consumers. How should they be thinking?
Well, the first thing I don't think you should be doing right now is trying to shove product down people's throats, because it is insensitive, it is tone deaf, and that's a good way to lose all of your customers by not being in touch with the global reset that is happening. But what I do think, when your mind is quiet, if you're structuring and using your time properly, that's when the good ideas come in. We have a lot of clutter in our lives, and we have so many things that we focus on, and many of them probably aren't making us as much money as others. And I would say now is the time to focus on fewer buckets and really grow what does work. And if you can't get through a door, get through a window. Find different ways of doing business. The whole world is shifting. So that's the good news. It's not just you. Everyone is changing. Every job will be different. Every employment strategy will be different. So you have to look at everything around you and know that you're not the only piece on the board moving. The whole board is moving. So how are you going to look at the whole board, and where will your pieces land when this thing starts to settle?
All right, let's go to a video question. Jackie is the owner of a communications agency in Wichita Falls, Texas. Here's her question.
Hi, Gary. I'm Jackie with Hager Communications. I own a small marketing firm. What opportunities and mostly trends do you see coming out of this once business gets very busy again?
Great question. Yep, great question. I think that the biggest opportunity really is the thing we're using right now. I think the live and video conferencing infrastructure is here to stay. Happy hours with your friends, 10, 20 people meetings. So I think a lot of small businesses can really use that to do the kind of meetups and things that they wanted to do in their physical locations. Virtual gatherings, education, experiences is going to be a monster trend post this, because we're all just getting used to it at scale. Every age group, every kind of crack in every different angle. You're just seeing so many more people jumping in this infrastructure, and I think a lot of people are going to stick with it.
Bethenny, what do you think?
Well, it's funny because when Gary and I were growing up, the idea of online dating was preposterous. It was just something you would not do. It was something you wouldn't even think of. It had a stigma to it. And now it's really the way that young people meet each other. There's no stigma. It's actually a stigma if you're not doing it. So the same thing now, we're all sitting home, we're all structured, we're realizing, we've opened Pandora's box, we're realizing how much we can get done at home. I mean, even with children with schools, I realized that between snack time and going to lunch and going to gym and getting a time out and choice time and art, kids probably need 2 hours, 3 hours a day to actually really learn. So adults, we're screwing around also. We sit in the gym longer than we need to. We talk, we go get a latte, we get a snack, we gossip about TV. If we want to really work efficiently, it's also how many of the big companies are working, like Google and some of those big tech companies, where they have time for parents and time for chefs and to create a really good life there. Well, we're having a life at home, cooking our own meals now, spending time with our families if we're lucky enough to do so. So we're finding new ways in, and that's kind of what Gary's saying. And I think it's going to be a new normal. And we may go back to offices, but commercial real estate will change. People will realize they need much less space than they did. I'm realizing staffing is changing. So many people I know need much fewer people working for them. So you're going to have to work much harder to prove that you're valuable in your job, because people around you are seeing that not everybody has the value that they've had before.
Let's talk about the gig economy. Lawrence from Ohio writes, I'm a freelance photographer, and what advice do you have for people in this gig economy who are just paid freelance, ad hoc? What do they do at a time like this? Gary?
Gary, you know?
For me, this is the time to build brand, because I think Bethenny's exactly right. Going into sales mode is really hard. So if you're a freelance photographer, DMing everybody and being like, hey, can I take photos? That's just completely tone deaf. So for me, now it's about storytelling. I think this is a huge storytelling era. Why did you get into photography? Showing your day-to-day, post-editing old videos that you shot at a wedding or things of that nature. The reality now, and I've been yelling about this for a decade, if you are not producing content on the internet, you are leaving all your opportunities on the table. So right now, the opportunity for freelancers is to show their work and their stories and who they are across LinkedIn, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, podcast, on and on and on. There's just no other option.
I think it's also about
Bethenny, we've got a question.
Sorry.
No, yes, continue.
I think it's about how people are messaging.
Please.
There are probably 10 ways to tell the same story. There are 10 ways to get to the same location. So, for example, I have a show coming out called The Big Shot with Bethenny, which is going to be about finding sort of a successor, and it'll be showing my real business, etc. So I was thinking, how am I possibly going to post that we're now going to be hiring applicants for that, or choosing applicants? It seems tone deaf. But then I thought to myself, there's never been a greater amount of unemployment, and people are going to want to find unconventional, non-traditional ways. So my only point to that freelance person is it's about the messaging. It's about how they're going to find their way in to tell whatever story they're telling, because there is a way in, and a lot of people are going to be moved out, and the strong will survive now. And I think it's a lot about old school hard work. Anybody who's successful, doesn't matter how good of a filter they have on their Instagram. It doesn't matter how cute they are, how hot they are, how, tight, how high up their ass their thong is. The bottom line is hard work is how you are to be successful. And right now we're going to see who is a stunned deer because their little box has opened up and shifted, and who really understands getting your hands dirty, pulling yourself up in your bootstraps, and working hard. So those freelancers, work your ass off and you will be successful.
Gary, but this takes us to Nick. He's an e-commerce owner in Los Angeles who hears all that and wants to work really hard. But he's saying, how do you stay motivated at a time like this where you can't go to work and maybe you have a business that can't go virtual?
I mean, Nick, what's the alternative? Like, what do you want to do? Dwell and cry? I mean, to me, this is, look, I mean, this is, if you're not feeling motivated right now, you need to ask yourself, do you even enjoy what you're doing? The reality is that, like, this is suffocated options. This is, summer Fridays are out the window for 98% of the people once we get back into this. How to stay motivated. To me, everybody uses words differently, but motivation to me is to me, it's a requirement to be motivated to get through this. I mean, listen, life is actually wildly basic. You're either going to sit and dwell about things you can't control, or you're going to get optimistic and practical around things you can control. And that's it. It's as simple as that.
And people are going to see
Let's
this.
go to Kathy from Pennsylvania.
Sorry. I like listening to what Gary's saying and commenting on what Gary's saying.
Fire away, Bethenny.
Let's go to Kathy from Pennsylvania. She's got a video question for you.
I'm Kathy WOLPER of Kitchen Wizards in East Norriton, PA. For over 18 years, we've presented cooking programs for children and for adults in the Philly suburbs and New Jersey. Now I find myself with the opportunity to reinvent the business and offer online programs. What's your advice for the best way to monetize pre-recorded videos in this increasingly virtual world with limited resources?
Well, Gary, you're going to have to answer
Bethenny,
that
she's
one.
got... Bethenny, to
You're
you.
gonna have to answer that one. That's for you, Gary. I'm not a tech
Oh,
person.
all right, Gary, back to you.
That's for you.
Okay, thanks for the pass, Bethenny. To me, what you want to do is you want to put out where everybody's getting caught up, and I've seen this over the last 3 weeks, is everybody wants to put their content behind a paywall and then just think that people should be buying their courses while everybody else is scared of their own economics. I think it's the reverse of what most people think. I would put out the majority of the content or create new content for free. I would host free 1-hour Facebook Lives and then use that as a gateway for people that are really interested and want to level up to maybe then pay for some sort of subscription or premium content. Too many people just want to sell the content. There's too much free content on the internet today. So you've got to actually build a community that in some way is guilted or is just so grateful and goes and converts into your paid program. And that is foreign to most people. Most people do not want a romance. They just want to go in for the close.
All right, then, Bethenny, you're perfect for that last question. You're a person who says, I don't do tech, I'm not going digital. What do you say to all of those businesses out there who just keep getting that advice? Oh, do it online. If you don't want to, Bethenny, what do you say to people who are like you?
It's not that I'm not online. I am, but I don't love it and I'm not good at it. And there are a lot of us that are not good at it, and we have to accept who we are. And you don't want to go start competing with Michael Jordan in the landscape of basketball. So like I just said before, we have to find our own way in. And yes, we do have to create a community. And yes, we have to find ways to create content that's different and set ourselves apart. But to all the people, because Gary was talking about this before, the blanket statement I want to say to all the people that are worried about being home, this could be a gift. I have been asked so many times about people who want to leave their job. They're in a cubicle. They can do better. They feel stuck. They have a 401k. They don't, and I always say, when you jump, you fly. In my book, A Place of Yes, I talk about that fearful moment that most people don't have the luxury of jumping because they do have kids and rent and a mortgage. Well, right now, everything's out the window. Now is the time to plan and plant seeds, and those flowers will grow. And now you have to jump. So prepare yourself with your parachute, but take time away from your family, be organized, be creative. I may not be the best at tech. I can find someone to help me with that, but I am the best at the concept. So you sit back and you say to yourself, okay, this was given to me and presented to me in my life for a reason. I'm not going to sit home and just eat Oreos for 4 months and then wonder why I didn't learn Italian, learn how to use the internet, learn how to be organized, learn what this means. This has meaning. So take it as a gift and fly with it.
Well, you two are both a gift. You're advising people to capitalize on their signature styles, and you both certainly have yours. Gary, Bethenny, thank you both so much. We're going to leave it there.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.